Okay, so welcome. As you know, I'm Suraj Uttamchandani, and this program is being put on by the methods consultation people, for which you have flyers in front of you. And today I want to talk about writing the qualitative dissertation proposal. But as you can imagine, I added methods of them because we're not going to talk about the entire proposal. We'll focus here on methods. So as you see, there's the Kilbourne article. For the most part, this talk is based on the Kilbourne article, plus some of my own strong opinions, plus some of Jessica Lester's opinions, and that together kind of comprises this. So like I said, the format is going to be, I'll just present this, and then feel free to interrupt. Since it's a small group, we can interrupt and talk on each slide, or we can just wait and have questions, whatever. I'm pretty agnostic about how we want to do that. Okay, so in a dissertation proposal, oh, now this video of us is in the corner. I hope that doesn't cut off too much. So in a dissertation proposal, a qualitative dissertation proposal, oh, my laser pointer doesn't work. Wow, this whole thing is going quite badly. No, just kidding. Okay, so in a dissertation proposal, you've got the introduction, which is your overview and your background, the problem, the theoretical perspective, your questions, your literature review, your methods, your ethics, and your plan and timelines. That's kind of what Kilbourne would argue. I think there's some room to kind of reorder here, but today let's focus on the methods and ethics section. So within the methods, I would say these are the major things you need. Your study design, your site/context, your data sources, your analytic procedure, quality, positionality, ethics, and then appendices for details. By the way, I'm happy to share this PowerPoint, so just let me know and I'll happily.
Right, analytic procedure is data analysis procedure?
Yes. And so basically the rest of this talk, I'll have one slide for each of these and we can know what they are. But I do want to highlight that before any of this happens, before any of your methods, you should have already presented your research questions. And constantly throughout the method section, we're referencing our research questions because the goal of the method section is to convince the reader that your methods are appropriate for answering the questions that you've already laid out. So I'm not thinking about the research questions as part of your method section, but they're really important for it, so they're way up there.
Makes sense.
Here are some extended quotes from Kilbourne. So the aim of the method section of a proposal is to tell how the inquiry will be approached and to show how the specific methods have a reasonable chance of answering the questions asked. A method section may have two parts. The first part is a justification for the general approach to the inquiry, for why an experimental, correlational, survey, phenomenological, interpretive, critical, and so on approach to the inquiry is the appropriate path to follow, given the nature of the problem. How much explicit justification is needed is often a function of traditions and expectations of a particular field of inquiry. Fields where quantitative empirical inquiry has been the dominant approach may require a fairly lengthy justification for a qualitative approach, whereas proposals in fields that have embraced qualitative inquiry may have only a few lines and no explicit justification for the approach at all. And then the second part will be a detailed discussion of the specific methods that will be used for data collection, interpretation, and presentation. And the main question is whether the methods are adequate for answering the research questions that the inquiry has proposed. This aspect should be specific and concrete, even if the plans may change once the inquiry is underway. Early drafts of proposal are frequently too vague on these points. Potential committee members recognize that not everything can be precise at the proposal stage of a qualitative study, but they are looking for evidence that the author has thought through these issues and recognizes their significance to the overall quality of the work. That's just kind of our overview here. So let's take each turn by turn. First, study design. So in your study design section, which kind of comes first in your methodology section, you'll name your overall methodological approach, like a discourse analysis or an ethnography or a case study or whatever you're calling it. And you should, if you're going to introduce a big idea, like let's say I'm going to introduce discursive psychology and I require a lengthy treatment of what that is and what its history is, then that should be here early on because everything else can then reference it. And you should explain the overall structure of the study as part of this. So if the study is structured as a curriculum intervention, then you should here kind of start to describe, if not the curriculum itself, how many days, kind of an overarching sense of what that is going to look like. You don't have to give details at this stage, but tell us that it's a 30-day intervention or that it's a 2-year ethnography or that it's a, I guess what I really mean is like a time anchor here can be really useful. And that's basically all I have to say about study design for the moment. You want to interrupt or should we just go through the whole thing and then get into the details?
Just continue.
Just continue, yeah, okay.
This is also where, in the study design, there should be also some kind of justification of why the study design picked versus others, because a lot of study design are so similar to each other.
Yes,
Like,
and I
well,
think
within the so, for example, as far as I know, within the qualitative tradition, we can think of all qualitative type of study design in the qualitative tradition are almost phenomenological in some sense. All qualitative research is somewhat phenomenological in some sense. However, there is some distinctive feature between basic qualitative versus phenomenological. Phenomenological is interpretive and heuristics. So is there is there a justification should be there why this specific one?
yes.
Okay.
And in all of these sections, there should be an explanation. And one of the best ways that you can explain is to anchor back to the research question. So you're usually well off if you can say, given that the research question focuses on participants' viewpoints of this thing, interviews and focus groups are appropriate, or whatever it is.
Makes sense.
There was something else you said that I thought was useful that I wanted to comment on. So these qualitative, like I think in general, we should be a little bit deeper than qualitative approach, but it depends on your field. So partially your justification is coming from methodology, and partially you're anchoring to conversations in the field. So if in your field, let's say, we've measured this construct 1 trillion times through surveys and through tests, but like nobody's ever done it qualitatively, that is also part of that justification that you're building in your study design. So mapping to the question and mapping to the field. I think depending on how you've written the proposal, it might be that that part of the conversation you've already sort of previewed when you got to the research question, but maybe not.
Makes sense.
So that's study design. Next is the site and context. This is the what question. So in the School of Ed, you would name things like your teacher collaborator, your associated school, wherever that site is. And the goal is to show help. The goal is to help the reader to make sense of everything that follows. In some proposals, it's worth articulating why this site specifically or why this site aligns to the research question. Sometimes you have already done that. Sometimes you picked this site sort of because it was convenient that you knew this teacher already, but you might talk about, oh, previous work with this teacher has suggested that this will be a fruitful site for this inquiry or whatever. For out-of-school organizations especially, like if you're working with a community-based group or something that's not a school in your research, it's helpful to discuss the history of the organization and things like its leadership structure. But I would say try not to be super gratuitous here. Like those things are usually relevant, but don't say things just for the sake of saying them.
Makes sense.
For schools, this is the same idea, right? For schools, you can give demographic information, age, etc. But I said would be deliberate here. So for example, I'll often see things like, the study was conducted in this school, it has this % free and reduced lunch and this % white or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think that, like, let's be really thoughtful about what it is we're saying about the school and why we're highlighting these facts as the ones that are important to know about the school. So I think that can be useful, but give some thought to that. For classrooms, if you're going to have a curriculum, this is a good place to say what the curriculum is, I think. You can also kind of put that in the data sources question. If let's say you're pulling Twitter data or YouTube data or whatever it is, here's a good place to give background on the website and kind of the source of the documents of the data. So not all studies will have a site or context because not all studies are interventions or observations in the same sense. So let's say my study is 50 interviews. Maybe it doesn't have a site per se, but this could be a good place to explain your sample or how you, like if all of those interviews are with Black women faculty in math departments, then here's a good place to explain why that context and how you'll kind of recruit participants. And sometimes positionality goes here. My positionality actually went here in this section because I have been working with this site for a really long time. Something that I think is worth highlighting is that your positionality can go in any number of places, so wherever it kind of makes sense, and sometimes in multiple places. And depending on the nature of the study, sometimes it's much more highlighted and sometimes it's a little bit backgrounded. Data sources. This I think in some ways is the most traditional and the most kind of natural. This includes what the data is and how it's being collected. So as Kilbourne says, details should be included about who, what, where, when, how many participants, observations, interviews. how frequent the observations and interviews, how long, and so on. I would say like my strong advice is that you give numbers here. So if it's a number of documents, say it's 50 documents about 43,000 words. If it's interviews, say something like it's 15 interviews for about an hour each, about 15 hours of data. Whatever it is, I think numbers are really helpful here, even in qualitative research. It helps kind of lay out the scope of your data collection. And I really encourage you to be specific. So for example, you could say, I'll collect 15 interviews. Well, that is not enough information. We really need to know what those interviews are about. And the best way you could do that is by giving either the interview protocol or some sample questions. So for something like that, include 1 to 2 of the sample questions in the body, and I strongly encourage you to include the interview protocol in the appendix. Because without that, you haven't given the reader enough information. 15 interviews is not enough information. If your data collection is like temporally based, like there's something that you'll do at the beginning of the semester and then in the middle, and then maybe you'll have an interview at the end, provide a timeline. A figure of a timeline can be really useful for telling us like this is when this data is being collected, or this is where the data is from, or something like that. And sort of in general, tables and diagrams are really, really useful, especially if your data set is really varied or collected over a long period of time. So if your data set is 100 documents and they're all from the same time, then maybe not a figure, but like, for example, well, actually, I do say always with an asterisk because nothing is always, but I think summarize this section in a tabular form. So for example, this was in my proposal. And as you can see, I have aligned the time that the data is from to the research question, explained what the type of the data is. In this major, you can kind of already feel as you look at this, that research question 2 is this kind of deep ethnography. So we've got this primary record and then these sort of supplemental records. I explain the type of data and then the quantity of the data in numbers as best as I can. And then this last column won't necessarily apply to everybody, but because my first study was discourse analytic and my second study was a little bit more interventionist in some ways, that was an important thing to highlight. And so as you can imagine, the prose section here was quite long as I explained each of these things in turn. But then at the end of the day, I could show this table in my presentation and say, so that's the data set. And it's relatively clean. And so I strongly encourage you to use a table to summarize your data. That's also my encouragement for the final dissertation. Any questions or anything here, or shall I just carry on? So analytic procedure, I would say this is the place where I've seen committees have the most issue. So you have the data, what are you going to do with it? As Kilbourne says, with regard to the analysis and interpretation, the proposal should indicate how the researcher plans to go about data analysis and from what point of view or theoretical perspective the data will be interpreted. So examples of things that are here, things like transcribing, coding, memoing, line-by-line analysis, those are here. Usually that's only the beginning. You really have to spend a lot of time explaining what those things are and how you'll do them in the order, but those are the kinds of things that live here. You really have to be more thorough, pedantic than you think you do. So you really have to be kind of over the top specific. First, I will download all of the documents. Then I will organize them in this thing. Then I will take each of them and do this to them. Then I will collect all of the codes. Then I will. So be linear and sequential. First, I will. If you're going to use software tools, here's a good place to name them. And I think a little bit of justification about not necessarily why that tool, you don't need to explain why you're choosing Atlas TI over NVivo, but why you're using a tool in the first place. So you might say, I will use Atlas TI to organize the data and to aggregate the codes or something like this. And so here's some other strategies that you can use to make sure this section is not as vague. It's really good to name outcomes. So if you're saying that what you're doing is thematic analysis, and then you're going to do some inductive coding, say at the end of the analytic procedure, the result will be several themes. Or maybe if you're doing coding, you might say at the end of the analytic procedure, the result will be a tabulation of what percentage of each code was in the data or something like that. So kind of think forward to what will happen by the end of your analytic procedure. And this requires a wild amount of specificity. So I strongly encourage you to give examples. For example, in my dissertation, I was analyzing PowerPoint slides. and I had not done the analysis yet, but I put a sample from the data set into the proposal and said, this is like what it might look like when I analyze this, and then we'll see if that pattern is true across the whole data set and whatever. And I think that helped tremendously, because without that example, the committee was sort of like, okay, so you're analyzing PowerPoint slides, like, I don't know what those slides look like, I don't know how you're gonna do it, but then I was like, this is sort of like what one of these slides looks like, and here's how I'll treat it. And
that would actually save me yesterday.
there you have it. So, like, and this is what I mean by like a wild amount of specificity. If you're gonna do deductive coding, we should know the coding scheme at this stage. Put it in the appendix or put it in the document. And even if you're gonna do something like a thematic analysis, you can say like a theme that might emerge is that the bilingual schools highlighted multiculturalism more than the monolingual schools. Like, even if that's, even the committee is happy to say like that is probably not what's going to happen, and you haven't done the study yet, but you should show like the kind of thing that might come up. I think for some committee members, like for a lot of qualitative research, we might say the findings are emergent, the analysis will really be bottom up, and we'll see. And I think that that can often be the reality of the study, but doesn't necessarily sit well with committee members. So you could say, like, this finding is not at all what I might find, but this is the kind of thing that could emerge in the analysis. And so I really recommend that. A thematic analysis, this is the kind of theme that could emerge, even if I don't know that it will be what happens. Then you want to have a quality section, like how will we know that your research is trustworthy, right? So quality, validity, trustworthiness are kind of synonyms depending on what community you're in. As Tracy would write, are these findings sufficiently authentic that I and research participants may trust myself in acting on their implications? More to the point, would I feel sufficiently secure about these findings to construct social policy or legislation based on them, which is sort of a high bar. So when you think about quality, draw from the specific methods and cite methodology, and specific criteria from your specific methodology can be helpful. So for example, if you are doing a discourse analytic study, there are some nice quality markers in the discourse analytic community, like deviant case analysis. And then I printed off for you Tracy's general qualitative criteria for high quality qualitative research. So that's another place you might draw. So common examples of things here would be negative cases, member checks, triangulation. But it's not enough to just say those things. You have to explain why those things support quality and how exactly you'll do those things, etc. Oh, that was the end of that slide. I thought there was more there. There's a lot more to say about quality, but I'll just leave it there for now. Positionality and ethics. Acknowledgements and assertions are not enough. Beginning with the idea that subjectivity is inevitable, researchers should systematically seek out their subjectivity to enable researchers to be aware of how their subjectivity may be shaping their inquiry and its outcomes. Depending on your field, positionality is more or less expected, but I would say it's important to have at least to some degree. So this is asking questions like, what is your relationship to the data? What is your relationship to the analysis? And how will you ensure that participants are cared for? And usually the bar for this is a little bit higher than the IRB, so it goes beyond participants will cite a consent form, but this is also a good place to say the study will be IRB approved, participants will sign a consent form. Also, I will ensure that the research study is ethical by doing X, Y, and Z. Positionality and ethics could be its own section, but it could also come up in multiple places that makes sense. So for example, it might be that in your study design, you say, well, I'll be with that community for 2 years. That probably is a good place to talk about your positionality if that's the kind of study you're doing. And this is sort of a mixed metaphor, but I kind of feel like, so in your positionality and ethics section, one eye is looking inward and reflecting on you, like based on who I am and what I've done in my own experiences, this is how that might shape my inquiry. And the other is kind of like, how do those things affect the participants and how do they affect the outcome in the product? Now, this is like its own workshop. I could go on with this forever about positionality, and it's sort of highly personal, so it's kind of hard to offer some general ideas, but feel free to come in for a consultation, and I'm happy to talk about that at length. So here's kind of my overall tips on the proposal. The lighthouse question is a metaphor I use, like if you're deep in a writing and you like don't know what you're doing anymore, picture the lighthouse that is casting out what it is you're trying to do. The lighthouse question of your methodology section is convince the reader that the methods will generate a suitable, meaningful, and trustworthy answer to the research question or questions. That is the lighthouse. So if you're deep in that analytic procedure section and you're like, I don't really know what I'm doing anymore, I just like am here writing, hoping for the best, that is your lighthouse question. I think the devil is in the details, like the proposal should be as precise as humanly possible. Kind of, for me personally, it was like a little bit unnatural. It was like unnaturally detailed. Like, then I'll do 8 of these, and then I'll download 9 of these, then there will be 4 of these. But that level of specificity is what's expected.
Then I'm gonna have a burrito for dinner while I'm doing this.
Right. Maybe not that specific. And then charts and tables and images are your friend. And I think people forget sample data, charts, tables, pictures, pretty graphs are all so helpful. And they're helpful for a few reasons. One, they're kind of a nice summary. Two, they really help organize your thinking. Like if I showed you the prose section of this table, you would panic a little bit. It's like a little scary. But then I show you this and you're like, this man knows what's happening. By the way, I didn't collect any of this data. That's fine. So that also, things can change. And in addition to them being helpful for your reader, they also are actually going to save you a lot of time later, because when you go to present the PowerPoint at your defense, either your proposal defense or your dissertation defense, that's what you'll put on the screen is the diagram. So you kind of have to make it anyway as you prepare your PowerPoint for the defense. So just put it in the document. In fact, I was at a defense recently where somebody was asking a question and the person had this nice table in their PowerPoint and they showed that, and the committee member's response was like, so in your revision, just put that table in the document. Like, that was the answer to the question, why isn't it in the document? So some resources you can use. Of course, most of this I drew off of Kilbourne. I want to remind you that Phil's book and Coakley's book we have procured through IUCAT through a collaboration with us and the Education Library. So both of these books are really nice start to finish guides on kind of general qualitative research, and they're free for you. And then I printed off Tracy here, which is kind of just some thinking around quality criteria and validity. I also want to highlight this because I think people maybe don't know about this. I didn't know about this until I was proposing. You can access every dissertation that has ever happened at IU, more or less, for free online through the library. And I strongly encourage you to find all the dissertations in your department from the last 6 or 7 years. And from your advisor for all time or whatever. In fact, you might be able to find your advisor's dissertation.
Oh yeah.
And that can also be helpful. I think this is like not always that helpful for the proposal, but it's helpful generally. And then of course the consultations, which I am happy to talk more about. So that I think is what I have to say about the qualitative proposal. Do y'all have questions or anything that we want to talk out? And even if you want to transition off the proposal into general things that would be helpful to talk through.